Salman Rushdie is the author of 14 novels, 1 collection of short stories, and 4 works of nonfiction. His books have been translated into over 40 languages. The book you're all here for tonight, Quichotte, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and has received rave reviews from Time magazine and the New York Times, among others. Inspired by the Cervantes classic, the protagonist in this story, a mediocre writer of spy thrillers, creates Quichotte, a salesman obsessed with television who falls in impossible love with a TV star. Together with his imaginary son, Sancho, Quichotte sets off on a quest across America to prove worthy of her hand. Meanwhile, his creator, in a midlife crisis, has equally urgent challenges of his own. This book is especially apt in the age in which we now live, an age where fact is so often indiscernible from fiction. Of the book, author Jeanette Winterson says, "Lovely, unsentimental, heart-affirming, a remembrance of what holds our lives in some equilibrium, a way of feeling and a way of telling, love and language." Rushdie will be in conversation tonight with Dolen Perkins Valdez, author of the New York Times bestselling novel Wench. Among other accolades, she is a 2-time NAACP Image Award nominee, a First Novelist Award winner, and a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Fiction. She is a member of the Penn-Faulkner Board of Directors and an associate professor in creative writing at American University. I believe some of her students are actually in attendance today. Please now help me welcome to the stage Dolen Perkins Valdez and Salman Rushdie.
All right, so nobody came.
The cliche of like your heart pounding is happening to me right now, but I'm going to try to make it work. Okay, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm really
It's to
good.
be more of a problem.
You know, it's so interesting because when you read your work, the first thing I think to myself is, this man has an interesting mind. I would love to talk to him. And I'm sitting here talking to you. I can't believe it. It's crazy.
Let's go.
Talk to me about the origins of Quichotte. We all know that it is inspired by Cervantes, Don Quixote. And I'm wondering how this novel came into being.
Well, you know, my books usually come into being in quite a messy way. It's like I have fragments of things and I don't often understand how they go together, and I only gradually come to see what the book is. And bits of this book I'd had in my head for quite a long time. You know, the material about the opioid crisis, for example, I'd been looking into that for quite a while. The science fiction element in the book, in a way, arose out of a failed project to write a science fiction series for the Showtime network.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, working for Hollywood, it's an education.
I would agree.
I mean, what they did, I spent a year doing drafts of a pilot, and after each draft, they would say, "This is the best thing we've ever read. This is the most brilliant original material that anyone in television has ever had an opportunity to, and we are so behind it." You know, that would happen. And then after a year of this, I got a text message which said, "We've decided not to go in this direction."
That is so Hollywood. It's very different from the book world.
It's very different. Anyway, so, you know, I hate kind of wasted work. And so that stuff stayed with me, and a bit of it in different form got into this book. So some of it was that. And then some of it was that, I think 4 years ago, when I was actually writing the previous novel, it was the 400th anniversary of Cervantes and Shakespeare. You know, and so there were a lot of literary events where we had to talk about both of them, and I was asked to write something about them. And so I thought I'd better read it, Don Quixote, which I hadn't read probably since I was 20. So I mean, almost, this is a terrible thing to say, almost half a century had passed. and what had happened in the meanwhile was that there's a much better translation. When I read it at the age of 20, what was then the standard, the kind of Penguin Classics translation, was quite hard going.
It was awful.
It was quite, you had to really wade through it. And at the end of it, I thought, okay, but I kind of don't get it. Why is it that this is the book that everybody says is the birthplace of the novel, etc.? And now, picking it up again, there's this brilliant translation, the Edith Grossman translation. And it was like reading a completely contemporary novel that could have been written yesterday, and was so vivid and alive and excited me. And immediately, or almost immediately, I began to think about my variation of these two central characters. Because I had been thinking about a road novel. When I was writing The Golden House, almost all of it takes place in New York City. And I remember thinking that when I finish this, I have to leave town. I have to. And I actually, for a moment, thought that I might do it as a nonfiction project, that I might rent a car, which would probably not have been, as in the novel, a beaten-up Chevy Cruze. Might have been better than that. But that I would write a kind of travel book where I would go across the country in a kind of de Tocqueville way and see what happened, And I even went so far as to ask my younger son, who was then, I guess, he's 22 now, so he'd have been 18, 19 then, if he would go with me on a road trip. And at first he said yes, and then there was a sort of comic pause. And then he said, "But Dad, are you going to drive?" I said, yes. I've been driving longer than you've been alive. What are you talking about? And he said, "Yeah, no, I don't think you should drive." Anyway, so I fired him and decided to make it up, which actually, in the end, I'm happy I did that, because you don't want to be limited by what happens to you. You want to be able to invent everything that you want to happen. So then that non-fiction road novel combined with reading Don Quixote, and suddenly I thought, I think maybe this is a book. And then actually I wrote it quite fast. Once those pieces fitted together.
What do you call fast?
I mean, like a year and a half. Just about. I mean, by the time it went through the whole editing process, it was probably 2 years. Yeah.
Some of the reviews said that this was a story through Trump's America. And I don't know that I necessarily agreed with that, because I felt it was America's America.
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason why the name of the 45th president is not to be found in these pages. Actually, there's more than one reason, but there's a... but I really thought, I'm sort of not interested in him enough. He strikes me as he's not even a character.
He's not even interesting.
No, he's a performance in search of a character. And I just thought, not interesting enough to write about. And also, the moment you say that name, it just sucks all the air out of the room. And then everything becomes about that. And I really thought, I'm not writing about that. I wanted to get, out of my comfortable area that I know very well and get into this colossal and very different, changing, metamorphic country, and see what happened if I sent these two rather eccentric characters, through it. How would that go? And I wasn't writing about Trump. I was writing about America, and also a lot of these macro issues that people have talked about in regard to the book are not only American issues. These things are happening elsewhere in the world too. And so I thought I was writing about something more interesting than Trump, which is almost everything, actually.
Well, and some of the scenes do take place in London, but I wonder, do you consider this an American novel?
Yeah, I think I do. The last three books, this one and the two novels before, have both been, primarily set in America, very consciously, in order to try and, writing books, novels is my way of understanding the world I'm in, and telling myself stories about it is my way of trying to get to grips with where I am and what's happening, and so since I've been living here for almost 20 years, it's not surprising that the books, in a way, have made that move as well. They all, including this, have as central characters people of Indian origin. I don't think. This is as was mentioned. This is it's the 14th novel and the 15th book of fiction. Blah blah. But I've never yet managed to write a book which did not have a central character who was of Indian origin. And I just think it's who I am. It's these are the eyes through which I see the world. But in a way, I feel I should set myself the task of not doing it. Mm-hmm. But I haven't done that yet.
So, I'm kind of, because of what you're saying, I want to jump to this question, which I hadn't planned to get to until later, but about racism in the book. Quixote and his son, Sancho, travel through the U.S., and they have these racist encounters. One of them happens in a park that's very direct. Also, they go to this imagined town of beautiful Kansas, and you reference this real-life murder. I remember when this happened, when this Indian engineer was shot to death in a bar.
Shot in a bar, yeah.
And you reference that episode in the book.
And the real town, beautiful Kansas doesn't exist, but it's in exactly the place where where this crime took place, which is a town. I think I get the pronunciation wrong all the time. I think it's called Olathe. Olathe, which turns out to be a Native American word meaning beautiful. And so I thought, because I don't want to write about the news story, I want to be able to fictionalize it so that it fits in with what's happening with my characters. I don't want to use the real name of the town, because then that fixes then I have to talk about the news story, But if I could just slightly change it, then I'm free. And so I thought, well, I'll call it what the name of the town means. So beautiful Kansas doesn't exist unless you speak the Native American language of the region, in which case that's what it's called. And that happened a few times on this journey, that there were places I knew about. Sometimes I changed the name, sometimes I didn't change the name. But I wanted the freedom to reimagine them. While at the same time not wanting to be an idiot, and I wanted to know what I was talking about. For example, there's a passage in the novel in which they arrive in this town in New Jersey just on the wrong side of the tunnel, and people are turning into mastodons.
Right.
Which, as far as I know, is not happening in the New Jersey area at this time. And the town has a made-up name.
Beringer?
Beringer, which is the name of the hero of Ionesco's play Rhinoceros, in which people are turning into rhinoceroses.
And a mastodon is some kind of prehistoric elephant?
It's an elephant. It's like a mammoth, but not so woolly.
Okay, but not so woolly.
And where that came from was... what I was going to say is that even though the town is fictional, people who are familiar with New Jersey immediately recognize it as Weehawken, which actually does exist, and in which, as far as I know, there are no mastodons. But there we are. What I thought was, when I was 19 years old, when I was at Cambridge, I was cast in a student production of Ionesco's Rhinoceros. I mean, I wasn't the lead. I didn't play Béranger. But I was just one of the townspeople who were turning into rhinoceroses. And because the thing is written like a farce, there's a lot of running on and off stage. And every time you run off stage, there's somebody in the wings who sticks a bit more rhinoceros on you. And then you run back on. And I was 19, and I really didn't fully understand the play. And I remember saying to the producer, what's this about? And he rather sweetly, gently said to me, he said, Salman, it's about fascism. And I said, oh, how? And he said, well, it's about what can happen in a community or in a country when suddenly the people living next door to you are monstrous. They've turned into monsters. Suddenly, the family whose children were playing with your children has become so changed and altered that they're alien to you, and you can't understand their language anymore, and you're scared of them. And it's about that. And I thought, that's clever.
And I'm thinking right now, so this is about Trump's America. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, I thought, I can't remember which, some very great writer once said to me, if you're going to steal the good stuff.
Steal the good stuff.
and so I thought I'd steal this, and I can't have rhinoceroses because he had rhinoceroses, so I'll have mastodons. But I thought maybe, the reason for doing it is I thought maybe in a way we're there again. Maybe we're there in this moment when we don't understand our neighbor, when our neighbor suddenly seems to be frightening to us, alarming. Yes. And what a wonderful way it is to talk about that, because it plays entirely as comedy. In fact, as broad farce, but it's actually some quite dark material.
It's kind of funny because when they enter the town, the hotel guy is checking their teeth to make sure they're not enlarged.
Yes, that's right.
That's a hilarious scene.
Yeah, that's the thing that, you see, one of the things I really love about a certain kind of great literature is that terrible things can be described in completely comic terms. I think one of the reasons why I love Kafka so much is that his manner is completely comic, but his meaning is not.
Right.
So, if a man wakes up in the morning and discovers that he's lying in his bed and he's turned into a giant bug, there is some dispute about what the bug is.
Right.
Because Kafka never exactly tells us what the bug is. The consensus opinion is that it's a dung beetle.
Right.
Although some people say cockroach. Anyway, that's a comic idea. A man turned into a giant bug. But the meaning of the story is tragic and poignant and sad. And the same with the castle. Every single scene in the castle is a comic scene. It's played as comedy, every single scene. And yet the cumulative effect of it is what we now call the Kafkaesque. And so I love that idea of being able to use comedy to say things which have a dimension which is not at all comic.
I love that, like taking yourself seriously, but not taking yourself seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things this reminds me, I wanted to ask you about like your relationship with the real, because we're now talking about Kafka and bugs. And so there's this book I teach to my students sometimes, Letters to a Young Novelist by Mario Vargas Llosa. And he talks about levels of reality point of view. And one of the levels is spatial levels of reality, spatial point of view, temporal levels of reality, all of these ways that a writer can shift between these levels.
Yes.
In your book, you switch so seamlessly between levels of reality point of view. Some people call it magic realism, some people call
I don't.
You don't?
I don't, because I think that term belongs to a certain group of Latin American writers.
Yes, I've often argued that, but I think people want to expand it.
I know, but what I think is there are these various terms which are used in different countries at different times. In America in the 70s, there was this thing called fabulism. In France, before that, there was what was called surrealism. And they're all the same thing, essentially. That there's I mean, what we've just been saying about Kafka, that's magic realism, but I mean, man turns into giant bug,
right.
could be in a Garcia Marquez story.
Right.
Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, the devil comes to Moscow and creates havoc and is accompanied with a ginger cat who has a pair of 6 guns. And another friend who is so thin that when he turns sideways, he disappears. I mean, any so-called magic realist would be happy with that material.
Right.
What I'm saying is this thing crops up in every literature, and the magical realism, that term, I think belongs to, Garcia Marquez, Carlos Fuentes, Manuel Puig, those guys.
Right.
And actually, Mario Vargas Llosa is the one who rejected it earliest, and really defined himself against that as a much more realist writer, and so the great opposition is Garcia Marquez and Vargas Llosa, and they represent opposite things, and not just because they had a fight, not just because Mario punched Gabo and knocked him down.
I didn't know that.
And not just because it had something to do with Mario's wife.
So if you reject the term magical realism with your work, what term do you?
Well, I don't. What I think is I'm trying to find ways of telling that fit the story I'm trying to tell. And so there are books that I've written which are essentially, like The Golden House has almost nothing that you would call magic realism, and Shalimar the Clown literally also has almost nothing except for one thing, but never mind. Sometimes it's very much in this fabulist vein, and sometimes it's not. It just depends what the story needs, And in this case, I wanted to write a story, this journey down this road. I wanted it to change all the time. So, in the way that, I guess in some version of real life, if you're going down a road having adventures, the adventures can be of different kinds, And so there's a bit of this book which reads like a spy novel, and there's a bit of it which reads like a realist story of family life, and there's a bit of it which is like a science fiction novel, and it does this metamorphic thing, and that's what I was interested in, to write a book in a certain way that would allow it to change nature as it went on, and not just be a mess, I remember I talked to a writer friend of mine when I was writing it, the writer Kiran Desai, who won the Booker Prize and so on. Anyway, I told her roughly what I was trying to do, and she's very, serious and truthful, and she said, "Oh, it's a high-risk book." and I said, "Well, yeah, I guess so." And she said, "No, because if you can do what you're saying you want to do, then it'll be amazing. But if you don't, it's going to be a horrible mess." And there's nothing in between.
And then you went off and had some vodka.
And then, I went off and had another vodka. Yeah, exactly.
I heard you say that the bigger the car that you build when you're building a novel, the bigger the engine has to be.
Yeah.
Tell us what you meant by that, because I think this is connected to what she told you, right?
Well, what I think is, for me, story has always been the engine. That if you're going to write a really big book, you better have a really interesting story to tell. And what happened to the novel somewhere in the early 20th century, somewhere around the modernist movement, was that these two things, storytelling and literature, decided to separate. So you have colossal, great novels like Joyce's Ulysses, which, the only thing they don't really do is tell much of a story. What happens in Ulysses? Man walks around city, while his wife is being unfaithful to him back home. Meets young writer in the red light district. They go home and go on drinking. The end. oh no, also not quite the end, because she's upstairs having a sex fantasy. But it's not much of a plot.
Right.
And the thing that makes it work is not story. It's everything else. But I've always thought that great period of the novel of the 18th century and 19th, really, but the kind of from, Thackeray, Fielding, Dickens, obviously, the storytelling is absolutely at the center of the project.
I agree.
And that's what I mean. If it's going to be this big book that tries to be panoramic, that tries to be a kind of what I call an everything book, you try to scoop as much of the world as you can up in your arms and put it in the book. If you're going to do that, or going to try and do that, then there better be something driving the reader through it.
And I felt very much Quichotte had a big engine. I mean, it was really delightful. I didn't want to read it fast. I wanted to kind of enjoy it.
Oh, good.
But I also didn't want to stop reading because I wanted to find out what was going to happen to this guy.
People have read it. I mean, now that it's been out a little bit, I've had some readers telling me about their reading experience of it. There are people who stayed up all night for 2 nights and just devoured it. Mm-hmm. And there are other people who do what I do, which is when I'm really enjoying a book, I slow down.
Yeah, so do I.
I want to read it slowly. And then there's one or two people who said they already read it twice, which is quite good, given it's only been out since Labor Day. I think I may be wrong, but I think it's Nabokov who said that if a book's not worth reading twice, it's not worth reading once.
So many books to read, and we have so little time.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I did a lot of work on the storyline because as we've mentioned, there are actually 2 storylines, because there's the main storyline, which is about Quixote and his son Sancho and going on this journey in search of love, because he's obsessed with this television star called Salma R, which is one consonant away from my name by some coincidence, and then there's this other storyline which actually arrived in the book somewhat to my surprise, unexpectedly, not part of the original plan, which is the story of the writer who is ostensibly writing that storyline.
Right.
And how their stories mirror and echo and differ from each other. And so I had to do a lot of work on 2 stories and on showing the relationship between the stories and on gradually bringing the stories closer so you saw more intimate relationships between the 2 narratives, and then somehow finding a way of uniting them at the end, which for a long time I didn't know how to do.
I was telling you in the green room that I thought the ending was perfect. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but
we can't spoil it because it's perfect.
Let me ask you something more mundane, because, I have you here, and how much time do we have? Okay, a few more minutes. Your character, Quichotte, is obsessed with reality TV.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of research that goes into the novel, but you had it. You knew everything about The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, all this other stuff. And I know you like film, because I've read that you like film, but do you watch TV? I'm just curious. And what do you watch?
I don't for fun watch this kind of television. This is not my poison, but it's his, and
it is.
And if you're trying to say about this character that he's actually had his mind warped by watching too much reality TV alone in motel rooms for many, many years, then I thought, well, I have to know what
you're talking about.
I have to know, so I have to do my due diligence.
So you're not a Bachelor fan.
Well, I have consumed my share of all of this. Real Housewives, that other family that begins with K.
Have you met any of them before?
I think I can safely say that I have not. No. Didn't meet any of the people from the Jersey Shore, or any Real Housewives, or any bachelors or bachelorettes. I think that's right. I don't think I've even met a Kardashian. I think I haven't.
Okay.
It's hard to do.
It is hard. They're everywhere. It's like
They're everywhere,
they're probably outside right now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of
hammering on the door, let us in. No, I mean, so I did watch enough. You know, I mean, you don't have to watch that much to get the point. But
But that's the point, that you watch it even though you don't need to watch it.
yeah,
anymore.
I know. But it's about addiction, you know,
Yes.
and he's an addict of this thing,
Right.
and it affects the way in which he sees the world, and actually in a serious way, the way that art affects the way in which we see the world. You know, if there are books that you really love, and maybe there are not in a lifetime that many books about which you could say, I really love that book, you know, then those books become a part of the way in which you see. You know, the book's way of seeing becomes also a little bit yours. You know? And that's true at the kind of, I don't like making these sort of high art, low art distinctions really, but if it's true of great literature, it's also true of reality television. You know, that if that's what you consume all the time, it becomes a part of your way of seeing. And that's what happens to him. And what can happen, because it's happened even in a little way to me, is that people who consume gigantic amounts of television begin to think that they know the people on the other side of the screen. Because the people are right there in their living room, sitting right there.
I thought I knew Oprah for a long time.
Yes.
Like I thought she was talking to me.
Yeah, but I think Oprah has that problem a lot. But even in my little non-Oprah way, you have the experience of people coming up to you and saying, you know, when we were last talking, you said something and I just thought about it and I don't completely agree. I want to tell you what I think. And I say, sir, we've never met. That was something I said on a TV show. And I said, no. We were having this conversation. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. That even when told that it's not true, they go on believing it's true. You know? And so I thought, so I take that and exaggerate it. So that there's this guy who's in love with this woman on television and believes that she will love him. That he will cross the country. He will go through a series of what he calls valleys, kind of like tests for himself to pass, so that he can become worthy of her. And then he's never met her in his life. And she is, as they say, way out of his league. But he believes that love will find a way. And he proceeds, you know. And that has something to do with, you could call that insanity.
Insanity, or the age of media, which brings me to the next question. You write in the book, after all, it was the age of the invented name. Social media had made sure of that. Everyone was someone else now. A lot of this book has to do with the various masks that we wear, right? Lots of people in there have nicknames. Even Brother, the writer, has a pen
Everybody
name.
in the book has a fake name.
Everyone has a fake name. Brother's son uses a pseudonym to mask his cyber activities. Do you think this fascination with invented identities is particular to this age of social media?
Yes, it's never happened so much. I mean, it used to be quite unusual to have a pseudonym. You know, I mean, some writers, of course, did. You know, the Brontes, of course, started off using male pseudonyms. George Eliot. But the pseudonym was a relatively rare thing. Now everybody has a pseudonym. If you have a Twitter account, you've got a pseudonym, you know. And so everybody is masquerading as somebody else. We're all actors now, you know.
I often feel very exposed using my real name is on all my social media, and it feels very odd.
It's unusual. It's unusual. There's a wonderful line in the great movie Les Enfants de Paradis. There's a line in which the main actor Jean-Louis Barrault says. He says, les acteurs ne sont pas des gens, which means actors are not real people. And I feel that we've all become that. We've all got fake people versions of ourselves walking around, telling other fake people versions of themselves the stories of the lives they don't have.
A friend of mine used to call that sending your representative.
Oh, that's so. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. You know, I was friendly with the great German novelist Günter Grass, and he said about becoming colossally famous, he said that sometimes he felt there were two people There was a person called Gunther, who his wife and friends and children knew. And then there was a person called Grace, who the world knew. And he said, sometimes I send Grace out into the world to make a noise and do stuff so that I can stay home and work.
Do you feel that sometimes?
Sometimes. Yeah, I mean, there was certainly, it's less so now, but there was a moment in my life when everybody in the world had an opinion about me, which wasn't based in ever having met me or read a sentence that I'd written. But nevertheless, it was strongly held. And I thought, that's weird.
And I'm sure there are a lot of people who come up to you and say they're a big fan and they've never read a single word.
But I know.
You can tell.
I always know. Yeah.
How do you know?
Well, I don't very often go to the so-called Hamptons, but I was there. I was there several years ago, and I was at some fancy house of a party, and the lady of the house came up to me and said, I love your work. Your work, I love it. And at this point, it became clear to me that she knew nothing.
Just from the way she said it.
And she's the hostess, so I should have been polite and let it go. But I thought,
didn't.
I didn't. So I said, well, any particular book? and she kind of flushed. And finally she said, oh, the one about the devil. And I thought, okay, now I know that you didn't read anything, and you know that I know. So we're done here.
It's hilarious. Okay, one more. Let me see. One more question before we move on. Opioid crisis.
Opioids,
it's a big part of the book.
It's a lot of it, yeah. Because Quixote, when we meet him, is a pharmaceutical salesman, and his cousin that he works for, he gets fired in chapter 1. But anyway, his cousin is a big pharmaceutical entrepreneur and a crook. And basically part of the problem that everybody's facing in this country right now. 50,000 people a year dying. Yes. One person dies of Ebola, and it's all over the front pages of the newspapers for a month. 50,000 people a year die of opioids, and hardly anybody talks about it. So anyway, so I thought, and also the problem is worst in these little towns in the middle of nowhere,
right.
Through which my characters are traveling. And so I thought, well, if I'm sending them on the journey in this part of America, then this has to be part of the subject. And then it became very useful in the plot because Miss Salma R, the autobiographical character, is an addict of these things, Percocet, Vicodin, Oxy, fentanyl, and that gives him a way of meeting her. So it became a useful plot point. Mm-hmm. But that's one thing.
She's very humanized. I really felt her pain.
I'm glad, because the thing about her is that he sees her as a fiction. He sees her as this fantasy. This woman who is beautiful and successful and powerful and famous and has everything. But when you get to who she actually is, rather than the fantasy he sees on television, she's very damaged. She has a history of sexual abuse as a child and by a family member, and she has a bipolar condition which she inherited from her mother and grandmother, and then she becomes an opioid addict. So there's an enormous amount of loneliness and pain in her, which is the truth of her, as opposed to the fairy tale, which is what's on TV. And I wanted to do that to show what's behind the mask. And so so it became a very important theme in the book.
Yeah, it's very, very well done. Okay, so we have to do audience questions,
yes, your questions
now.
Okay.
Do you have the ending in mind when you begin a novel?
Oh, that's a great question, actually, because the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. There have been books where I've been absolutely clear about the ending. When I wrote The Moor's Last Sigh, almost the first thing I wrote was the last page. And it gave me a thing to aim at. which was not just in terms of the story, it was also in terms of the kind of tone and mood of where it should be, the end of the story, And it was just like a target, go until you hit that, And sometimes when you think like that, when you get there, it doesn't feel right anymore, But in this case, it did. So that ending essentially stayed the ending of the book. And the only other person I've ever heard say that in exactly that way, slightly more successfully than me, was J.K. Rowling, who said that she wrote the last chapter of the 7th volume of Harry Potter right at the beginning and put it in a safe, and then got to it, and that was the last chapter. So she was able to see on a 7-book arc what the last page would be, which is, mind-blowing, really, but,
right.
If true.
My daughter loves J.K. Rowling. She would want to hear all about it. What would be your top piece of advice to aspiring novelists?
Oh, find another line of work. No, what I actually, the thing that I think really is, maybe it may seem obvious, but the thing that's really important, I think, is get to the end. Every time I've ever written anything, once I've got to the end, even if it's in a very crude, imperfect state, I can immediately see what it needs.
You have something.
And actually see what I've done, and then I can say, okay, it doesn't need this, it needs much more of that, this needs to be done differently, but I can see it, And when you're in the middle of the act of, something out of nothing is the hardest thing, by a million miles, the hardest thing. Once you've got something, and you're trying to make something better out of something, that's easier. And so the thing is to get something there, and then work on it. So get to the end. That's my advice.
Do you read fiction for pleasure? Any favorite modern writers? I'll tell you, I asked the author Mitchell Jackson, who interviewed you earlier this year, for advice, and he said, well, he's read everything. And that gave me a little heart attack, because I thought, we're going to be talking, I have no idea.
I haven't read everything. And I've read less and less of the new stuff.
Okay.
Because there's so much of it. And it's hard. There's a moment at which you stop reading to keep up.
Okay, yeah. Because there's so much to read.
But there's so many great books, that waiting to be read. But I do think that there's something very interesting happening in American literature right now, which is the two groups. One is American writers of color, and the other is new immigrant writers, are transforming the literature. And so whether it's, if you look at African American writing now, you've got in every field, you've got exciting voices. You've got Tracy K. Smith, Natasha Trethewey, Jasmine Ward. Whether it's theater or poetry or fiction or nonfiction, there's something happening there. And the other thing is, American literature was always very influenced by immigration, but historically it was either Eastern European Jewish immigration or Southern European Italian immigration, and those were big in American literature. But now there's people from everywhere, literally everywhere. Like just this year, this young man Ocean Vuong, so there's Vietnamese American, and before him Nam Le, another very good Vietnamese American writer, and then there's Chimamanda Adichie from Nigeria, or there's Jhumpa Lahiri from South Asia, or there's everywhere.
Right.
And I think what that's doing is not just bringing in narratives from other parts of the world, but also bringing in ways of telling from other parts of the world. So it's both formally and in terms of content, it's very interesting. And then I thought to myself, actually, hello, I might be much older than these people, but that's me too. I come from somewhere else. I've got bags full of stuff, with other shit in it. And maybe it's time to start unpacking that stuff and throwing it out there and seeing what happens in
so you're inspired by some of the younger writers.
I think it's quite interesting to be inspired by younger writers, because it tends to be not what happens,
Right.
Normally you're inspired by you're looking at your contemporaries all the time, and you're looking at the great dead, and your conversation is with those two. But it's very interesting when the conversation becomes with much younger writers, and that's been helpful to me in thinking.
Okay, next one. Thank you for your contributions to literature. To challenge ideas is to have the right to push boundaries and to sometimes offend. In this time of extreme polarization, it seems that being politically correct is more important than challenging ideas. How do you find the right balance?
Sorry. Look, being politically correct is kind of living death. A book that is only politically correct is not alive because it's too busy minding its manners to be alive. And as far as offense is concerned, everything offends somebody. I mean, I go into bookshops, there's lots and lots of books that offend me. Some of them are written by Dan Brown. But I think he should be allowed to live. And probably publish. Well, I'm not sure about that. But what I'm saying is that I get offended by junk. That's what offends me. I tried to read 50 Shades of Grey.
You did?
I did. I thought,
You want to see what the ruckus was all about.
Yeah, and also kind of like no men read it, and all women read it. So I thought, that's very weird. So there's one of those things on Amazon where they put up the first chapter. So I thought, okay, I'll read the first chapter. First chapter isn't even very dirty, but it's so badly written that it was actually...
That it offended you.
It was impossible to turn the pages. He walked into the room, OMG, he was hot. I thought, that's a book that people are paying money for?
20 million people paid money.
20 million people. Well, as they say, a fool and his money are soon parted. So 20 million fools. No, I was just saying that there's plenty of things that get up my nose, and I mean, that's the kind of comic end of it. There's more serious books that I don't like. And it's been said that there are some people who don't like some things that I write. But that's okay. That's why in a bookstore there are lots of different books. You find the ones you like and never mind the ones that you don't like. And I think I've always said, and at the time when, I was in the middle of all the fuss, I had to say quite a lot, that if you're being offended by what you're reading, you should shut the book. At that point, it loses its ability to offend you. So, just a tip. So that's what I think. I think, people have to write what they have to write, which doesn't mean, by the way, that people can do anything they like and think it's fine. I mean, I think if you're going to write about subjects which are far from your own experience or which are sensitive, you have to do your homework. You have to know what you're talking about. In my last book, not this one, in Golden House, there's a character who is very conflicted about gender. Is trying to decide whether or not to transition. And although I have known a couple of people who have gone through that process, clearly it's not something that is personal to me. But I wanted to write about it because it's so much a thing right now. And then I thought, well, I've got to find, if I'm going to write about it, I have to find out about it. And I have to do the best I can to find out as much as I can about the psychology of this and what it feels like, and then have a go at representing it. And then if I do it badly, it's fine that people should say he did it badly. But I mean, that's say I feel I have the right to do it, but other people have the right to tell me it's crap. And it's my business to do it well enough that they won't feel that. And that's what I think it's about. Everybody has the right to every subject.
But you're saying do the work.
Yeah, if you're having the right to it, doesn't mean that you can be lazy about it. You have to do it properly. And I was actually amazed when that book came out that nobody trashed me for the transgender.
You were bracing yourself.
I thought, anybody says anything about this, they get trashed. So I thought nobody noticed, which would be disappointing.
Well, that means you did the work.
Well, I feel tomorrow now there'll be some huge. but I feel maybe that I did do the work, and therefore it seemed as if it was that the book knew what it was writing about or where it was writing from.
Okay, I think this is the last question. You are known to use myths and classic texts in works. Yeah. If you were writing a novel on Britain's current political and social environment, what myth or classic work might you use?
It's such a good question. Well, Ian McEwan has just published a novel called Cockroach.
Yes.
In which he reverses Kafka, in which a cockroach wakes up in bed.
Becomes a man.
To discover that he's in this large body, which is not only a man, it's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think it's a brilliant idea. And so that's one way. That's one way. Which Ian's got there first, damn it. Otherwise, I might have wanted to do that myself. One of the things I think, because it's interesting about the way in which myth works in a society, is that what's happening in Britain, to some extent here as well, is that there is a myth that's being sold to people about the past. And they're being told, if only we could do certain things, like get out of Europe, expel all these foreigners, get back to kind of, white England, everything would be better because it used to be better. And so this myth of the past is used to justify actions in the present, and it's quite like, what the message of the red hat. Mm-hmm. I want to know, when was it? What is the moment of greatness to which we should now aspire to return? What was the date? My best guess would be somewhere around the 1950s with kind of Norman Rockwell families. And
which was itself a myth.
Which was, of course, itself a myth. The point about the Golden Age is it's always a myth. It's always a fairy tale, But when we're asked to make America great again, how long ago was that? Were there still slaves? Was it when women didn't have the vote? Was it before the civil rights movement? When was it? Because how can we make America great again if we don't know when it was great? Tell us. I think we should be told. So what happens is that unscrupulous people construct mythologies which serve their purpose in the present. And actually, going back to Ian McEwan, he'd had another when we were all much younger, he wrote a television play called The Ploughman's Lunch. If you go into a pub in England, even now, there's a lot of pubs which will have on their menu a thing called a ploughman's lunch. And if you order it, it will be a half of a French baguette roll and some brie and some cheddar and a sliced up tomato and some lettuce and some salami.
Okay.
Right? There is no British ploughman who has ever eaten that meal. Most of it is French. It's a completely fictitious thing. There is no such thing as that ploughman's lunch. So again, they're inventing a fantasy of a kind of bucolic England when people ate things like this while reclining on the lawn wearing straw boaters. And it's done in order to sell something in the present. So mythology, it's not just writers who use mythology. We're in an age when politicians, public figures, are using fake myths of the past, fairy tales of the past, in order to justify what they're up to now. And I think...
And you think Britain is also doing that?
Absolutely. What do you think they're up to? Boris Johnson, he doesn't have a scruple in his body. And all he can do is tell lies. There's somebody else of whom that's true, but closer to home, particularly in this town. But they have in common, those two, Johnson and Trump, the inability to tell the truth. What naturally comes out of their mouth is a lie. If they say hello, it's a lie. And yeah, he's entirely, for reasons which are absolutely venal and self-serving, selling the country this fairy tale of the golden age of England back in the good old days, in order to justify this disaster. So yeah, we live in this strange age when politicians tell fairy tales and fiction writers have to tell the truth.
Wow. Well, to end on a positive note,
yes.
In 4 days we will know who won the Booker.
Oh, that's so positive.
And I just want to say good luck. I'm really excited for you.
I'm on the plane tomorrow.
You're on the plane. Let me tell you something. The last time Marlon James was in D.C., I dropped him off at Union Station. He was going to get on a train, get on the plane, and head to London. I said, good luck.
And he won.
And he won. And he texted me from London and said, I won. So I'm hoping that I'll give you the same kind of...
Okay, well, I have your good mojo.
Yeah, good mojo.
You.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good.